Hey there. Let's talk about Harriet Jacobs and Frederick Douglass. Okay, so there's a few things I want to talk about, and I will try not to be long, but we know how I am at that. Okay, number one, I feel like there's more of an echo in here. They got new towels up here, and it's driving me crazy. So just in case you're like, why does she sound weird or feel weird? It's because I feel like I'm echoing. Anyway, so let's talk about number one, the evolution, because that was actually your question for your response. One of the things that I see is the biggest evolution, I think we actually should go back to Equiano. So we look at Equiano, then we look at Jacobs, then we look at Douglass, and that's really the order I think we need to take those in. So if we look at Equiano first, really now you've read through more stuff, I think you can actually see that while it's an interesting piece, the writing wasn't great. And we kind of talk about the things that were left out, make it more questionable, make the narration more questionable. And so we're not as willing to believe Equiano. So that's one issue with that one. Also, this one was really more, this happened, this happened, this happened, and we kind of talked about how it was the ins and outs and how that could have happened to so many people. It just wasn't very specific. So then, the next person we want to talk about is Harriet Jacobs. A few things that happened here. Number one, she was a woman. And number two, this was more the first time that we're talking about sexual harassment in slavery, so that's kind of interesting. And then her tone was really, really interesting, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but her tone, where we had Equiano, who was very specific, this happened, this happened, this happened. When we had Harriet Jacobs, she had a specific audience that she was talking to. We'll go back to it, but more it was white women. And if we notice the narration, she was actually asking for forgiveness a whole lot. She's like, dear reader, I beg your forgiveness here and there. So while we have Equiano who states it like it is, she really is begging for forgiveness, so she's almost ashamed of herself, so the tone is really, really different. Still, this one is about physicality, though. We kind of see the physical harassment she was going through. Now, we'll come back to it, but the thing that I see more happening with Frederick Douglass was, it was so much more psychological. Because if you notice, I mean, there wasn't really anything terrible that happened in this piece at all, really. I mean, nothing physically terrible, but it does kind of talk to the breaking of a human. And so we have this human who doesn't know about his brother and sister, doesn't know who his mother is. He's that one little thing with his mom where she walks all night and like gives him a cookie, and then he says, when she died, I didn't really care all that much. I mean, he cared, but not much. And so how he didn't have a family, he didn't have a home, and he actually says slavery does away with fathers as it does with families. And so it also, we'll talk more about that in a second, takes away this idea of manhood, takes away the importance of a man in a family situation. And if you think about that, that's almost a little emasculating. So we go from straight, this happened, we change in tone when we get to Harriet Jacobs, and then by the time we're talking with Frederick Douglass, his piece is much more nuanced that he's really talking more about the psychology of it all. Okay, so I'll move along. I'm sorry. I know that was verbose. Anyway, so now with Harriet Jacobs, another thing that I think is really, really interesting that we need to talk about. Just a few things, we'll go. Her relationship with Dr. Flint. Now, if you know this, the story is based on a true story. We have here, her name is Linda Brent, and that's who she says she is, but this really was just her life. And so Dr. Flint in this piece is Dr. Norcrum in real life. So there was this happened. So keep that in mind, it is a true story. So with that being said, there's a few things that are just kind of interesting here. Number one, we talked about her tone. She begs for forgiveness. And then we have the relationship with Dr. Flint. Okay, so we see that, and we see this definitely as this really, really messed up, abusive. Most people do think, even though it's not said straight out, and we'll talk about that, but it's not said straight out that he probably was raping her. Here we see more harassment, but most historians think it probably was a little bit worse. And one of the reasons she probably didn't tell us that is we have to think about the time period, and we have to think that she was writing to mostly white Christian women to kind of get support for the abolitionist movement. So there's that. Also, though, there is something kind of interesting happening. I mean, she really, really had a very, very strong will. If you noticed her, kind of almost opposed to this Frederick Douglass character who seems like psychologically broken. You could not break her, kind of to a point you're like, oh, why? And this is one of the things my students often often ask is, why did sometimes she seemed to rub things in Dr. Flint's face and make him madder, and then he'd like slap her, like almost like she had a lot more power over him than she should have in kind of the institution of slavery, but she had power over him. And my students say, well, why do you say that? But it kind of shows itself here, and it's kind of just interesting that even though she was in slavery, she had that power. Now, please do not think that I'm saying she had much power, because she didn't. I mean, she was sexually abused, she was physically abused, and then there was that weird house he was going to take her to, which I'm so glad that didn't happen, because it's just disgusting. So there's the weird house out in the woods he was going to take her to. So she had that. Then, so that relationship happened. My students, I ask them this, and they always get mad when I ask them that. I say, did he love her? And because there is kind of this abusive back and forth thing going on there. Do I think he loved her? No. I think he wanted power over her, and I think it's really obvious that that's what he wanted. He wanted her to love him back. He didn't know how to do it, and so he was abusive. It's just such an abusive relationship. He begged for forgiveness. Do I think he loved her? No, I don't. I think he wanted power. I think this whole thing was about power, and maybe that was why she fought back as much as she did. Okay, so there's that. But then we have this weird situation. I've always thought this was a little confusing, and I'm just talking it out. But so we have Linda, basically, who she does not want to be Dr. Flint. She does not want to be his at all. So she gets pregnant by another man. And there's a situation there where she begs us for forgiveness. And we can even see it with that fight with her grandma, where her grandma's like, I cannot believe you did this. You have basically just cheapened yourself, is what she said. She would never have thought she would have given up her virtue. And virtue is a word that they used 1,000,000 times in here. So I have this problem when it seems like the grandmother knew what Dr. Flint was doing. I wonder why then she got so mad when Linda got pregnant by another man. And so some of the things me and my students have talked about before was that maybe she chose not to get pregnant, but she chose this relationship with another man. She didn't choose it with Flint, so therefore she has that kind of level of innocence, I guess. Also, some people have questioned, like, how do you know this baby was this guy's instead of Dr. Flint's? I don't think we do, but she definitely said it was the other guy's. So there's that too, but I just wonder why that grandma got so mad. And one of the things that's so interesting about that, even when she tells her grandma everything that happened, she says the one thing she really wanted was her grandmother to forgive her, and she makes a point of saying her grandma did not forgive her. She says, poor child, but she just does not forgive her. So it's really, really heartbreaking. And then the last thing I want to talk about with Harriet Jacobs was that room. That room is so icky that not the room he was going to take her out to in the woods. Later, when she escaped, she stayed in this tiny little room for 7 years. I mean, if you think about that, can you imagine? And the way the book reads, it doesn't say she ever got out. It says she was in this room. There was no heat. There was no air conditioner anyway, but there was no heat in the wintertime. And so it was just this really tiny room that she stayed in forever. It's so interesting that she was that willing, and she wanted to get away from that man so much that she was willing to do that, and that she saw her kids grow up. She could hear them outside the door, but she couldn't be with them, and they didn't even know she was there. I mean, that's just heartbreaking. Anyway, so really, really interesting piece. And then again, she begs for our forgiveness. She wants us. She says, I am virtuous, or she had to give up her virtuousness. And so there's that. And again, think about the audience, white Christian women. And so my students say, well, what power did white Christian women have? Well, they didn't have a lot of power, except for they were married to, most of the time, white Christian men. And white Christian men were the people who could actually make a difference. So that could be probably mostly why she chose this audience specifically. Also, there were some, besides for abolitionist activists, there were some women's rights activists who wanted her, so this was a really, really powerful piece, especially at the time. So then, moving on, if we go to Frederick Douglass, I love this piece. I do think it's really, really interesting and super nuanced, but there's not a whole lot that goes on in it. So one of the things that I always make my students do, and we write it on the board, but we'll just talk about it together, is that scene where he talks about his childhood, where he says, he ate off the floor, he used an oyster shell. He says he didn't really have clothes, but he could go swimming. He didn't have to learn anything that the little white kids had to learn. He didn't have to take, or he didn't get medicine. There's all kinds of things that we have there. And it sounds, if you look at it, it sounds almost like a really good childhood. Most of my students, by the time we paint that picture, they say it sounds like a really good childhood. But now, if we really, really think about it, if we treated a child like that today, they'd get taken away. Somebody, social services would come in and take a child away. And so the point of that is that even though this child maybe saw his childhood as a really good one, we see that this is a child who's not really cared for because he's a slave, and while he has this wonderful grandmother, this grandmother takes care of a whole lot of kids. And a lot of times, I think this probably was his biological grandma, but a lot of times in slavery, the grandmother figure was not necessarily a biological grandmother. I do think so in this case because she actually talks about her daughter. So there was that. And so it's just really, really sad. He shows us this happy childhood where we should be happy for him, but it really is terrible. And so I think that's really, really a great literary tool. There. Okay? Another thing I want to talk about, though, is the mother. So you have to really think about this. So his mother lived, they said, 12 miles away, So 12 miles away. So my students say, well, why didn't the mother try harder? Well, you've got to think, this mother did try really hard. Even that there is this one memory where this woman probably had worked all day, probably worked till the sun went down, and then went 12 miles there and 12 miles back, and then had to work another day. If you think about that woman probably didn't sleep at all that night. She probably walked through the night to her child, held her child in her arms, gave him what she had to give him, and went back. So while he almost talks about it a little bit coldly, like he felt maybe a little bit abandoned, she didn't have a choice. And so, but we see this woman who really, really did love her child, but she was in the institution of slavery and therefore couldn't do much about it. And so that's problematic. And again, he says he didn't really care all that much when she died. So that's interesting, tragic, sad, it's awful. One last thing that kind of happens in both of these. One thing in the institution of slavery that was it was weird, was, I think they talk about it really, really specifically in Harriet Jacobs, as she said, that slavery took the condition of the mother. Okay, so if you were a female slave and you had a child, no matter if that child was your slave owner's child or another slave's child or basically a neighbor, it doesn't matter. If the mother is a slave, the child is a slave. So now that really starts to cause a whole bunch of issues here. Number one, slaves could be almost white. And it's really, really interesting because we'll talk about how the owners, what they were doing was they would go in, and this is awful. They would go in, they would rape female slaves. They would have more children, more slaves, more money, and they would have their sexual appetite satiated. And that power they strove for, they actually had that kind of fulfilled as well. So it's just awful. And then she actually talks, though, about this kind of arbitrary nature of race. Like you could have, I think both she and Frederick Douglass were very, very light-skinned, and so they definitely both had white genealogy probably. And I think Frederick Douglass actually talks about how his owner probably was his father too. And so that whole issue was a big, big deal. The reason I say this again is because if slavery takes the position of the mother, or takes the condition of the mother, there is no use for fathers. Basically, a father is there, makes a kid, and has no say over it, gives no name to it, and basically cannot take care of his children and cannot take care of his family. And so that's really, really interesting in the institution of slavery. Kind of on the other hand, we had slave owners who didn't want to take care of their family, and they wanted to use them, make money off of them, and have more slaves, which is, so I just think that's so awful. And so Frederick Douglass talks about that, but I personally really do see that as very emasculating, that this slave man has no power to take care of his family. And that really is awful. So, I know, I'm sorry, I was long-winded and I said I wasn't going to be. So these are really cool pieces, and I do think there's huge changes throughout, but you really have to kind of dig in. So, I think that's about it. Y'all have a great week. Bye.